As the sun set on the 1951 season, the South Bend Blue Sox were riding high at the top of the world, the champions of the league. It should have been the beginning of a long and celebratory offseason, but it didn't take long before the party's taste became more than a little bittersweet. The league was dwindling. There was no hiding it. The Sox had clinched their championship at home in a winner-take-all fifth game of a five-game series. Fewer than 1,500 fans showed up for the most exciting theater that baseball could possibly produce. That was 1,000 fans less than they'd averaged during a pedestrian regular season just a few years earlier. The culprit was television, a magical new technology that beamed entertainment directly into American households. No longer did families have to leave their homes to avoid evening boredom, and it wasn't just the All-American League that would suffer the fallout. South Bend held at least a half-dozen movie theaters within its limits in 1950. That number would drop significantly during the next 2 decades. Even attendance in Major League ballparks took a hit during the beginning of the television era. But Major League Baseball had radio deals and massive sponsorships. Soon enough, they'd be able to broadcast their games through the new technology, and they'd monetize the television as a new revenue stream. The All-American League had ticket sales, and if they weren't selling tickets, they weren't making money. Increasingly, they weren't selling tickets. During the off-season after the Blue Sox won their championship, the team in Peoria would be forced to disband. The Kenosha Comets, one of the inaugural members of the circuit, would also darken its ball field and leave its players to the wind. The situation wasn't much better in South Bend. 1951 was the third consecutive season that the team lost money, and it didn't take a genius to look at the sparse crowds and realize that there was some unfortunate writing on the wall. The team was aware of those omens even as they alighted upon the South Bend Country Club in September 1951 for a banquet celebrating their championship. Like all athletes do eventually, the players started to come to the begrudging realization that a career in sports was a temporary thing. In the end, age and injuries and time catch up with all of us. But in the case of the All-American League, the women had to contend with the reality that their league might give out even before their bodies did. All across the circuit, players had put parts of their lives on hold for the love of the game. Some had postponed marriage, starting families, pursuing education, or lifelong careers. There was a sadness that crept in with the realization that the league and the dream might end, and there would only be memories to show for it. Unlike in the men's leagues, the players didn't even receive championship rings they could keep as mementos. Realizing that the time was right to move on, and taking advantage of the opportunity to go out on top, a few contributors announced their retirements at the banquet and in the weeks to come. An interminable winter visited South Bend, and then came the spring along with the promise of another baseball season. The Blue Sox would ride again, at least for this one more season, and the grind began in earnest for the men in the directors' chairs. Reigning champions or not, they had the same job they had every spring. They had to field a team, at least 9 players they could position out around the diamond. By the end of 1952, they wouldn't have many more than that. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series we are going to dive into the history of the South Bend Blue Sox, possibly the most storied franchise in the brief but shining history of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertising is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League Players Association. And now, With all that out of the way, let's jump into the 1952 season, one filled with uncertainty, interpersonal drama, and a quest to defend a championship that became more fraught every single day. The soap opera began with an off-season the likes of which the Blue Sox had never seen. In the early years, it hadn't been the role of team directors to assemble their squads. Players were assigned by the league to maximize parity and competition. You got who you got, and you didn't have much say in it. But by 1952, things had changed. Teams had front offices and general managers looking to sign and swap players, fill weak spots and rosters, and do it all while keeping the team under an incredibly strict salary cap. The puzzle got even stickier when the Peoria Red Wings and Kenosha Comets folded, making available all of their remaining players in a kind of reverse expansion draft. But it wasn't as simple as just selecting the best players. Grabbing an all-star meant taking on an all-star's salary, and with several returning vets, including Gene Fout, the highest-paid player in the league, the Blue Sox needed to pinch pennies wherever they could. All of a sudden, being a team's general manager was something like a full-time job, and the Blue Sox gave the gig to their manager, Carl Winch, who agreed to pull double duty in return for a salary of more than $860 a month. That was $300 more than what his wife, Gene Fout, would make as the team's best pitcher and best hitter. The biggest splurge Winch made during the contraction draft was on Joyce Westerman, a hard-hitting first baseman and 8-year veteran of the All-American League. But placing a claim on a player was the easy part. Signing her to a contract would prove more difficult. It took until several weeks into the season before Westerman finally agreed to terms with South Bend and reported for duty at a salary of $110 a week. But once she did, she played her best season, hitting .277 across 86 games with the club, placing her firmly among the league's leaders. That year, the team hosted its own spring training in South Bend, a far cry from the halcyon days of league-wide pilgrimages to Florida and Cuba. Behind the scenes, team officials were tinkering with schedules, marketing schemes, and ticket prices, all in a vain attempt to keep the team solvent. By the time the heat cooled on the hot stove, the directors had put together a team that was competitive on paper, but maybe without some of the dominance that their squad had displayed a year earlier. The team had a lot of unproven talent and would lean hard on veterans like catcher Shirley Stovey Stoveroff, the kind of player who never put up numbers that blew you away, but just as rarely showed numbers that let you down. They brought back Charlene Shorty Pryor, a former Marine and nightclub singer who was also the fastest player in the league. Pryor hit .312 and swiped 129 bases during South Bend's 1951 championship run, but her numbers dropped off in 1952. She hit a paltry .239 and stole half as many bags. There was also Sue Kidd, the team's number 2 starter. She would finish the campaign with a .200 ERA. Behind her in the starting rotation came Janet Muncy, who finished with a .222 ERA, and after that, Georgette Vincent and her .236 mark. But most of all, there was Gene Fout, and in 1952, Gene Fout was about to post the greatest individual season in the history of the women's game. As a pitcher, she would close out the campaign with a win-loss record of 20-2 and a minuscule ERA of just .093. At the plate, she batted .291 with 12 doubles and 15 stolen bases for good measure. When she wasn't pitching, she was busy playing all 4 infield positions throughout the season, and on the rare occasions that she took a game off, she was likely to be subbed in late as a defensive replacement at second, third, or shortstop. To say that Gene Fout did it all in 1952 would be something of an understatement. She was also in her second year as the team's chaperone, and, oh yeah, she was still the manager's wife and had a child at home. Of course, you already know that it wasn't as easy as she made it look. In fact, 1952 might have been the most difficult season in the history of the South Bend Blue Sox, for all of the reasons you would expect, and plenty more that you wouldn't. We'll dive into a fraught 52 right after the break.
Today at the Granada Theater, cut yourself a chunk of hilarity as Abbott and Costello star in their first color picture, Jack and the Beanstalk. Adult tickets are just 42 cents at the Granada at 212 North Michigan Street in downtown South Bend. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
Usually, winning is the best salve for everything that ails a team, but not in 1952, and not for the South Bend Blue Sox. They won a lot of games that year, but no amount of winning could heal their shattered clubhouse. There was a lot of uncertainty surrounding the team, the league, and each of their futures. That frustration tended to manifest itself in the ugliest ways possible. Aware that the team was aggressively monitoring and shedding salary, players took every slight personally. When Joyce Westerman finally reported to the Blue Sox in June, Winch decided immediately that the newcomer would be his starting first baseman, displacing Dorothy Miller, who had been the team's primary first baseman a year prior when the squad won the championship. For her part, it was reported that Miller refused to speak to Westerman for the duration of the season. The team broke into factions, and Winch had no patience for any of it, keeping his office door closed and speaking very little to the players except to bark orders during games and practices. Players learned the starting lineup when the public address announcer shared the information with the fans in the stands. Carl Winch wasn't communicating with his players, and for their part, the players weren't communicating with him, including Gene Fout, his leader, his star, and his wife. Fout and Winch were not on speaking terms for most of the 1952 campaign, and because there was some distrust among the squad that Fout was a double agent who was sleeping with the manager, the rest of the Blue Sox didn't speak to Fout either. It wasn't a very functional way to run a baseball team, but somehow the squad kept winning in spite of itself. The first real volley of the year-long battle came between doubleheaders on June 4th, while the Blue Sox were still in first place. After the usually sure-handed Charlene Pryor made a pair of uncharacteristic errors to lose the first tilt for the Blue Sox, Winch benched her for the second game without so much as a word or an explanation. Pryor was a firebrand who'd had run-ins with managers before, and she confronted Winch in the dugout, demanding to know why she wasn't starting. Winch ignored her. And then, an unexpected voice chimed in. Janet Pee Wee Wiley was a youngster from South Bend, the only hometowner to play for the Blue Sox during their existence. Wiley had gotten her start as a Batgirl before she worked her way up to a spot as the team's backup first baseman. If Dorothy Dottie Miller had been displaced when Joyce Westerman became the team's starting first baseman, then Pee Wee Wiley had been forgotten by it. Wiley hadn't seen an at-bat or an inning of play since Westerman arrived, and she was sick of it. Seeing Winch ignore Pryor in the dugout brought up a righteous indignation within Wiley, and she let her skipper know it. Hey, she asked you a question. Winch shouted at Wiley to stay out of it, and Wiley offered back a sarcastic response. That was enough for Winch to send Wiley to the showers. A day later, she received a letter at home informing her that the Blue Sox had suspended her without pay for a month. As it would turn out, Wiley would never play for the Blue Sox again. On paper, this didn't hurt the Blue Sox. Wiley had been relegated to the team's third-string first baseman, a redundancy. In the clubhouse and in the stands, it was a different story. Wiley had been the team's Batgirl as a teenager, and the veterans on the squad had practically raised her. For the fans, Wiley was the local kid. For at least some of the players, she was something like their child. It wasn't that things had been good before the incident. They weren't. But the ugly way that everything went down with Pee Wee Wiley just meant that everyone dug their trench a little deeper and made plans to stay there as long as it took. Things were not better in the boardroom, where team leaders were desperately trying to make up a $20,000 shortfall, and even held secret negotiations to sell the Blue Sox to Toledo. The deal only failed because the Ohio investors backed out. Without any recourse, team leaders set to the work of aggressively cutting salary, and there was a feeling that no one's job was really safe, not unless you were married to the manager, of course. None of this was fair to Jean Fout. Winch wasn't giving her extra playing time because she was his wife. He was giving her extra playing time because she was the best player in the history of the league. But for jealous and frightened players riding the bench for the third time in 3 days, that was little solace. Knowing that the team was looking to save on player expenses made a lack of playing time feel like a lot more than a slight. Now, it felt like a threat. The daily grind of a baseball season is hard enough without having to share a dugout and a hotel floor and a hot bus with 18 people constantly at each other's throats. And it might have seemed that there was nothing that could bring the team together, at least until they found a common enemy in an unexpected place. On June 23rd, during a game in Rockford, Winch emerged from the dugout to argue a call with the umpire. This in itself was not a unique occurrence. Winch was prone to having colorful conversations with the men in blue on a more regular basis in 1952. Maybe he was just glad to have someone he could tee off on publicly who wasn't wearing a skirt. But this time wasn't like those other times. Winch hollered, and probably correctly, that the umpire was drunk. The umpire responded by punching Winch in the face. There weren't many moments during the season when the Blue Sox functioned as anything like a cohesive team, but this was one of them. They jumped the umpire as the official went berserk, even landing a blow on Jean Fout. It took police to bring the fracas to an end. Winch was fined and suspended. The umpire was banned from the circuit. The Blue Sox went on to lose the game. But they were still in first place. Did the rumble at Rockford unite the disparate interests of the South Bend baseball team? Did the team coalesce after the moments of mayhem? Did it ease their interpersonal tensions when they had someone else to wail on, even for a few minutes? It did not. In August, before a game at Fort Wayne, the grounds crew was hustling to dry out a wet field even as the players were warming up for the contest. As a kind of last-ditch effort, they poured gasoline all over the diamond and then lit a match and watched as the baseball field went up in flames. It was a hell of a metaphor for everything that was about to happen with the Blue Sox. The proverbial straw that broke the camel's back fell on Friday, August 29, 1952. Charlene Pryor, the team's best base stealer and an all-star a season earlier, found herself riding the bench once again, and she wasn't happy about it. But with the Sox down 1-0 in the ninth inning, with 2 outs and a runner on first, Winch needed his speedster to come into the game as a pinch runner. He called for her from the third base coach's box. Pryor was wearing a pair of moccasins when she got the word. Flummoxed, she hurriedly changed into her spikes, bringing about a delay in the game. On the next pitch, Pryor was thrown out trying to steal second, and the game was over. A Blue Sox loss that dropped them 3 games behind Fort Wayne with only a handful of contests left to be played. Winch and Pryor had never had a good relationship, and all of a sudden the pot boiled over. Pryor was suspended for the remainder of the regular season for the offense of not being ready to play, and when Winch told her she would be able to return for the playoffs, she made it clear that she didn't believe him. Factions of the team mounted their own version of a protest. If Pryor couldn't play, then they wouldn't play either. Winch told them that they could suit themselves. Some players hastened retirements. Others sat out the rest of the season and hoped to catch on with another team the next year. By the time the dust settled, 5 players were gone, including the team's best base runner, its starting second baseman, its top catcher, and its only .300 hitter. On the eve of the playoffs, the Tribune's Joe Doyle compared the fallout to the 1952 Yankees losing Mickey Mantle, Yogi Berra, and Phil Rizzuto just before the World Series. The playoffs were about to begin, and there were only 12 players left. The newspaper called them the Dutiful Dozen.
Visit Albright's, Michiana's Columbia Bicycle Headquarters at 2720 Lincoln Way West near Playland Park. With new bicycles starting at just $2 per week and 200 used bikes available starting at just $3, there's never been a better time to get around on two wheels. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
The schedule makers had once again cooked up a nonsensical playoff bracket, and while the team didn't think it was exactly a good thing that they'd fallen out of first place during the last month of the tumultuous season, it was probably to their benefit. The first seed Fort Wayne Daisies drew the third seed Rockford Peaches. South Bend, as the second seed, marched into a matchup with the fourth place Grand Rapids Chicks, a team that finished the year with 10 more losses than wins. South Bend, of course, was missing a third of its roster, but in a 3-game series where Gene Fout could pitch twice in a pinch, they were the overwhelming favorites. As it turned out, they didn't need Gene Fout to pitch twice, and they didn't even need the third game. They wrapped up the series quickly, 2-0, and waited to see what happened on the other side of the bracket. Fort Wayne, the best team in the league, dropped their series, much to everyone's shock and surprise. That meant that for the second consecutive season, the Rockford Peaches and most of the South Bend Blue Sox would meet to contest the championship in a best-of-5, winner-take-all series. As the higher seed, South Bend should have started the series at home, but there were problems in Rockford that revealed problems around the league. Rockford Stadium, affectionately dubbed the Peach Orchard, was in the process of being remade into a high school football field. It was a harbinger of a problem that had been present for a while now. A local high school football game was probably going to draw more spectators than the AAG-PBL Championship Series. As such, the Rockford team petitioned to play their home games first, before their field had to be vacated. South Bend acceded to the request, and that might have been a mistake, because the trip to Rockford was a disaster. The Blue Sox dropped the first game 7-2. Gene Fout was on the hill for that one, and her worst outing of the year came at exactly the worst time. After the game ended, the grounds crew continued to do their work remaking the field for the high school football season, even though the second game of the series was scheduled for the next day. The Blue Sox dropped the second game too, and found themselves in the familiar place of being on the brink of elimination. But they weren't out of it yet. They were headed back home to Playland Park. They still had Gene Fout, and then there was another unexpected glimmer of hope. When the fences had been moved in between the first and second games, Carl Winch noticed that something didn't seem quite right. He went out and measured the distance to the right field fence at 188 feet, well short of the league minimum 210. When the Peaches won the game, on a home run that just barely cleared the short wall, Winch filed a protest with the league and waited to hear if his complaint would be upheld. The team's directors met with league officials in South Bend to discuss the matter during a heated debate that lasted into the early innings of the third game of the series. At the same time, there was intense action on the field and in the boardroom, and all of it went the way of the Blue Sox. On the diamond, they raced out to a 4-0 lead by the fourth inning. Between the fourth and fifth innings, the announcement was made that the Blue Sox had won their appeal and that the result of the second game did not stand. The contest would be replayed as if it never happened. Back on the field, the Peaches mounted a comeback when Gene Fout blew a save in the ninth, her second bad outing of the series. But the rest of the team, whatever was left of it anyway, showed out in extra innings to pick up their star. The Blue Sox won in 12. They'd started the day down 2-0. They'd finished it at 1-1. Outgunned and outmanned, the Blue Sox still found themselves in a series that could go either way. A loss in the next game put them up against the wall again, but it was a place they knew well, and they dug themselves out of holes before. The last game at Playland Park of the 1952 season was a must-win for the Blue Sox, and the home team did not disappoint. They walked off the Peaches in the 10th when Joyce Westerman, the controversial new signing who had set off so many fireworks through no fault of her own, bashed an RBI single to tie the series and send it to a decisive Game 5. This Game 5 was the replay of the redacted Game 2, and that meant the Rockford squad would act as the home team, except by now their stadium was a football field and they had no home. They found a men's softball field in Freeport, Illinois, and for one night only, it would be theirs. Whoever won the only professional women's baseball game ever played in Freeport would be the champions of the 1952 season. On a humid September evening, in front of 2,700 hostile fans, Jean Fout was standing on a pitcher's mound with a championship in the balance, hoping to exorcise the demons that had plagued her right arm so far in the series. For the Dutiful Dozen who stood behind her, there was never any doubt. Jean Fout pitched a complete game victory on the mound and added a pair of triples at the plate to deliver a most improbable second championship to South Bend. As the Rockford Peaches stalked off the field in disappointment, they could only shake their heads. The best player in the world had played like the best player in the world, and there was nothing they could do about it. When the Blue Sox were hoisted onto a platform to receive their championship trophy, they must have experienced the fullest complement of human emotion, elation at the victory, exhaustion at the grind, sadness at the friends who weren't there to share in the moment, anger at whoever they felt was most responsible for that sadness, but most of all, relief. Relief that the longest, hardest season of their life was over. Relief that for all of the awful moments, it was the last moment that had been the best one. Once again, the Blue Sox were at the top of their world, but as we'll discover next time, it was a world that was only becoming smaller. Hey, thanks for joining us on the Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. And if you want to know anything else about the All-American League, the History Museum should be your first stop. The History Museum serves as the national repository for the AAG-PBL Players Association. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Tune in for our next episode as we get into the final seasons of the South Bend Blue Sox and the AAG-PBL. Thanks again for listening. Keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.